This is a production of O'Brien Communications.
Hi, I'm Tim O'Brien, and this is the Shaping Opinion podcast. Our guest today is Jennifer Huddleston. She's a senior fellow in technology policy at the Cato Institute. In her work, she focuses on the law in relation to emerging technology. What caught my attention was something she wrote about the relationship between AI and the First Amendment. What happens when AI repurposes your words, your images, or even your opinions and thoughts? That's one of the questions we'll be talking to Jennifer about today. AI in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and artificial intelligence. Hi, Jennifer. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
It's good to have you. And one of the things the big thing that we're going to be talking about today is AI, artificial intelligence. And at this point in time, it may be new for some people, but it's not new for a lot of people. I use three, what they would call them, LLMs, large language model platforms. The biggest one and the one I use the most is ChatGPT. I use Grok. That's the old Twitter platform for AI, and Gemini. And I was just curious before we get started, what about you? How do you use AI and what platforms do you tend to use the most?
So you brought up the fact that AI may seem new for many people, but it's actually been around for a while. And so while you name several platforms, I think there's a lot of ways we're all using AI in our everyday lives that we don't think of as AI. So some of the most common ways that I would say I use AI are in things like talk to text, or the fact that I'm using a mapping service that's going to automatically pull kind of crowdsourced information about traffic issues and send me there the fastest way. The fact that oftentimes when you are dealing with an airline or a store trying to do some sort of customer service, you're going to interact with the chatbot that in some cases may make things easier on helping you at least connect to the right person, or maybe even being able to answer your question before you actually need that. Let alone all the things that have kind of been behind the scenes in the way many of us interact with things that we don't realize are AI. AI has been in our search engines long before we started to see generative AI services, like you mentioned, things like ChatGPT, Gemini, and Grok. It's also been used in various logistics and is now being used in some really exciting ways in areas like agriculture and medicine. So there are plenty of ways that we're already interacting with AI, even when we're not using some of those platforms that may have become almost household names. So ChatGPT is certainly one that many of your listeners or viewers are probably familiar with. Oftentimes when we say AI, it almost feels like it's interchangeable with that term in common parlance. But there's also Google's Gemini, and we've seen that also integrated into various elements of Google. You mentioned Grok. I think another one that many people may be familiar with is Anthropic's Claude. And some of the features that we've seen, for example, integrated into Microsoft products with things like Copilot that I think more and more people are starting to interact with on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting because as good as AI is, and I think everybody gets a little intimidated by it, just the idea of it. But then when they see it make mistakes, then it kind of humbles it a little bit. It actually, to me, it makes it more relatable. People can say, "Oh, it's not perfect," but case in point, we bought a house and we're doing a little bit of home improvement, and we're looking at the front of the front yard and everything. So we're downloading a picture onto the app, and we're saying, "Hey, put a tree here, put a bush there, paint the shutters this color, whatever." And then you get something back, and the tree looks like it's, on the roof of the house. They put sidewalks in places that don't make any sense that I didn't even ask for. So it's kind of nice that it's not there yet. But when you really look at what it does, it's just unbelievable how amazing the technology is. And we're in the infancy of it, so it's only going to get better. Is there ever a time for you when you look at I'm not just limiting it to the large language models, the chat GPTs, but is there any time that you look at it and it just blows you away at what it can do already?
I think there are several times like that, and I think it's actually a really exciting time to focus on the benefits of AI. We hear a lot about the risk or about these problems with hallucinations, and those are certainly conversations to have. And as you point out, I think it also is important to remind ourselves that this is the worst this technology is ever going to be. It's only going to get better and better quality from this if we let it evolve. And also, as you mentioned, it's important to remember all those good digital technology and media literacy skills that we've had. If something doesn't look right, if the tree's on top of the house, or if the case that it suggests as a precedent doesn't sound like something that's real, or you can't find it anywhere else, being able to use those good critical thinking skills and recognize that this is just a tool. It is not a replacement for our own thoughts. But in that way, I think it is very amazing what we are seeing various AI technologies do, both in terms of the way that the general public is using them, as well as in the way we're seeing them used in certain professional settings. So I'm going to kind of give one example of each. I think that AI and large language models, generative AI products like ChatGPT have a wonderful, what I have been saying, democratizing effect. So you mentioned, for example, taking a picture of your front yard. Well, it might have been that if you had a friend who owned a landscaping business a couple of years ago, you could have shown him that picture and he probably could have sketched out for you. Yeah, you may want to put a tree here and dig some irrigation here. And this is roughly what it would cost. And, not doing it as a formal estimate, but just kind of giving you that knowledge so that you had an idea of, okay, when I go and put in these bids, from various landscapers, what sounds right and what sounds a little fishy. Now, in part, thanks to the availability of generative AI products, you no longer have to have that friend that's a landscaper to get that kind of idea of, well, what are the questions I should be asking? What are the types of things that I might want to do with this space, or that I might need to ask my landscaper, or that I might need to ask the realtor, or something like that. And I think, particularly when we're thinking about in a small business setting, or when we're thinking about a lot of areas where people might lack access to the resources needed, um, and that we know that there are these kind of gaps between the number of professionals available and the number of people in need of professionals, that having AI that can help people even figure out the right questions to ask is going to be incredibly useful. I'm not suggesting that AI would, replace the landscape architecture designer, or as you experienced, because we know it's imperfect, but they can certainly help people along their way to figuring out, what are the questions I need to ask? How might this impact me? Is this something I want to look a little bit deeper into? Then I think when we think about some of the more ways that AI is being used in other areas, and particularly in areas where we're seeing more professional products, or products that might not be available to the general public, probably the one I get most excited about is the medical field. And where we're oftentimes seeing an ability to find cures for diseases, to really improve the quality of life through things like giving a stroke victim their voice back, and being able to allow them to communicate, to being able to find the types of studies that best align with an individual patient's need. I have a friend who has a child with multiple medical issues. He's 2 years old and has been through a lot. And one of the things that's been really fascinating to me is how they're able to use technologies, including AI, to both improve his quality of life as well as the way that they interact with them. So being able to identify trends in the home of when he's having seizures, not that diagnose why he's having the seizures, but just being able to note things like, hey, when the room is over or under a certain temperature, it seems like he has more seizure activity then, so that then they can be able to go to the doctor and go with something that perhaps establishes a trend that that medical professional can integrate into his treatment and care.
Boy, that was a lot, and it's so true. I've been using AI for a couple of years now in different ways and grown. And I think one of the things that the words you keep saying, you've said a few times, is ask the right questions. And I think the term that people use when they train AI is prompts.
Mhm.
And that's the thing. I think that's the skill of using AI that's the key for us. And that is because going back to that example of the house, if I say to if it gives me uh, burgundy shutters and I say I want green shutters, like I would say to a person, that artist would give me green shutters. They'd know what I meant. But when you talk to AI, if you don't say, I want the house to say exactly the same as you did it here, but only change the shutters, that's the only way to get the next version without any other changes. But if you don't tell it not to change anything else, it may put a tree in a place that you didn't even expect because you didn't ask for it. So the answer, the point that I guess that I'm making is that the more skilled you get at phrasing your questions and the more skilled you get at phrasing your requests to that, the better your results are. And it's not the machine is learning, but if you give it more precise, accurate questions, you'll get better results. And like you said, this is just the beginning for this technology. It sort of gets intuitive. So over time, it'll learn what we mean when we ask some of these questions. How would you compare the evolution of AI, like what stage we're in? Would it be fair to say we are still in the infancy of it?
I think we are still in the infancy of it, and I think that's important to remember, and that we don't know what the full potential of this technology is. If we think back to the last general purpose technology that really kind of created this sense of disruption, we'd be thinking about over 30 years ago with the internet coming about. And we certainly have seen how beneficial in many ways that has been to the spread of information, to the access that we all have, to the fact that we can record things like this podcast much more easily than back in a pre-internet era where you would have had to have a radio station and have me come into a booth and all sorts of things like that. With AI, I think we're still just seeing the beginnings of what that potential could be. And that's where the policy framework is going to become very important. We don't know what the full evolution of this technology can be. And I think that scares some people, but it should also excite us. And we want to be very careful about trying to dictate what direction the technology has to go. And we also want to be very careful about presuming that, the worst case scenario is inevitable. And I am optimistic that I feel like as we've seen over the last 2 years, more people get to experience AI, more people having, examples in their own lives where they've seen some of the benefits, whether it's of a product like ChatGPT or whether it's the use in some kind of professional setting. That more people are starting to recognize that perhaps the worst case scenarios we were hearing 2 or 3 years ago are less likely, and that we can spend more time focusing on how do we fully realize the potential benefits of this technology.
Well, you mentioned the 30 years, and I'm old enough to remember life before the internet, and I was involved with the internet when it came out. Specifically with broadband, I worked with some organizations where we took the people that I worked with went facilitated, I guess, the process from dial-up to broadband, and I remember at that time I was doing a lot of writing for I was doing ghostwriting for a CEO on this issue, and it was about the internet and about what it will do for communications. And the term you used earlier, you said it will democratize. And we use that term a ton. We talked about how the internet will democratize communication, that you will no longer have gatekeepers like editors and producers deciding what you can and cannot know. And it will be very, very liberating and freeing. And I can say that from, I don't know, I would say from around the mid 1990s, late 1990s to about 2015, that was true. I think it was democratizing. I'd say in the past 10 years, we've learned some things where the people who control the technology can work against democracy. And we've seen that with censorship on certain platforms. We've seen it with pressures from governments to censor, people and users. You see it in Europe right now with more regulations on how technology can be used, and how speech is regulated. So so when people I speak to classes about I'm a public relations person, so I speak to classes about this, and when they ask me if I have any concerns going forward, I think that's the one that I bring up a lot is we're not the thing that could have been so democratizing, human beings have intervened. It's not the technology that's not democratizing. Human beings have intervened to kind of take control of the technology in ways that is less democratic. Could you see that happening with AI in a whole different way?
I think that we do still have really robust competition in the internet era. And I think we can think about this particularly over recent history, whether it's Elon Musk acquisition of Twitter, now X, and some of the changes he chose to make on that platform, or whether it's new entrants, things like President Trump's own Truth Social, or on a different kind of area of the internet, things like Blue Sky that really has looked at trying to provide decentralized user models for a wide range of user areas. So we've seen that because we kept barriers to entry low, when people start to have the kind of frustrations that you expressed, or the concerns that you expressed, that one of the advantages of having a policy framework that allows new entrants to enter the market is if they felt that there was an audience that wasn't being served, they were able to do that. So, how this relates to AI is, as we kind of discussed earlier, we are in the infancy of AI. We don't necessarily know where this technology is going to go or what all those applications are going to be. I think some people see that and presume that, oh, because the large players are invested now, or because the large players that we're sitting here in 2025 saying are the leaders, are going to be the leaders throughout. And we don't know that yet, because this is very early days of this technology. And there could be some additional application or some additional model formulation that we haven't seen yet that becomes very competitive. Even amongst each other, we see both existing large players competing with one another on different kind of models and formats, as well as new players who we hadn't heard about, 5 years ago, unless you perhaps were really in certain circles and had heard kind of whispers of venture capital or something like that. Let alone, the way that we're seeing different approaches. Meta, for example, has a product called Llama that is an open source AI that is a bit different from the more closed source models. So really knowing everywhere this is going to go yet is a bit too like trying to predict who the largest internet players would be in 1996.
Well,
I
yeah, if you went by that, you would say it's going to be Netscape, companies like Prodigy, which
Right.
most people don't even know who they are at this point. Although the CEO of Netscape is still very active. But yeah, you're
And I
right.
and I think that what that goes to as well is the importance of getting this policy framework right. If we lock
Absolutely.
in very stringent regimes like what we saw in Europe in the internet era and what we've seen to some degree in Europe with AI, you risk locking in that only those early movers, only those first movers, only the people with the most capital can possibly afford to comply, rather than really keeping those barriers to entry low so that when there are people with entrepreneurial and innovative ideas or who see the market in a way that we might not have otherwise seen, can try and capture that place that they feel is being underserved.
I saw a term. I think the term Orwellian is used a little bit too much these days, but I saw a term the other day. They were talking about the Child Safety Act in the UK, and and one of the people from the government was defending it, basically saying that this increased regulation on speech is, or I think it was the Online Safety Act, not the Child
Yep.
Safety Act, but it's about basically, I think there's an age thing there, but there's a number of different statutes and things like that going on in Europe at different phases of implementation. All of them add up to the fact that they're trying to basically regulate speech online. And this one person from the government said, this is not anti-free speech. It's pro-free speech. As long as people have legitimate opinions, they can speak. And I thought, well, that's anti-free speech. When you qualify it by saying as long as people have legitimate opinions, then they can speak. And then I remember another pundit saying, well, free speech is a thing in China. Anybody can speak out in China so long as they speak out in favor of the government. And so you have these analogies out there and these anecdotes. What do you think about that? About the regulatory environment? And I do want to ask you. The reason I found you is an article you wrote, and it was a real catchy headline, talking about, is AI a horse or a zebra when it comes to the First Amendment? And you talk about the whole First Amendment. So I do want to talk about that, but I wanted to talk about Europe before we get to America, and that is, uh, are they overdoing it on regulation? Are they trying to control something that shouldn't be controlled, or do you think their prudence is worth it?
I've heard the joke before. I didn't come up with it, that at this point, Europe's greatest tech export is its tech regulation. That their decision has been to regulate the technology and to regulate American companies rather than to compete in the marketplace for various reasons. You mentioned several of the recent concerning laws that in some cases do seem to deliberately target American companies, things like the Digital Services Act or the Digital Markets Act. And then there are other laws that I think can, in some ways, provide a warning to Americans and American policymakers of what would happen if we start to perhaps not be as ardent in some of our principles and our values, even if they were for what may seem like good intentions. So you mentioned the Online Safety Act in the UK. It's a law that recently went into enforcement, and it concerns trying to keep children and teens safe online, something that I think many people care deeply about, not only in Europe, but here in the US. I'm a former teacher, so I certainly understand that that comes from a good place of wanting young people to have positive experiences online. But what we've seen is that the potential consequences for speech and privacy are far more reaching than perhaps advocates for such law had made them out to be. That now, for example, on parts of Spotify, you're having to verify your age in order to access certain things on that. That we're seeing things like subreddits have to verify your age, and that one of the biggest downloads when this law went into effect was VPNs in the App Store for people who were looking at ways to not have to verify their identity, to not have to give up sensitive information, their driver's license, and particularly at a time where we've seen several hacks of this kind of information. We can understand why individuals might not want to upload their ID or passport to a new social media app, particularly a new app that they might not know much about, and might not know its cybersecurity standards or things like that. And so this can have not only a real chilling effect on certain types of speech, and these laws go much broader than just what would traditionally be considered porn in many cases, but also in terms of the ability of people to access and have a voice at all.
That's true. I'm kind of torn because I'm a free speech fanatic, and I started my career in the media, and I've been in the public relations business, and my work could not exist without free speech and without the First Amendment. It just can't. And I'm amazed at the number of people in my field and even in the media who are for censorship in various forms. And I think I can understand it from the media a little bit, because the media looks at the First Amendment like press freedom. They don't look at it like freedom for everybody. They particularly key on a free press, but they don't necessarily think that the rest of us deserve the same freedoms. And I've had those discussions offline with my friends who work in the media, and it's always been interesting. But when you look at this whole issue of you know where it's going in, and what you mentioned, age checks, age verification. And I look at it like this too. This is the torn part. If you wanted to buy an adult magazine in a I don't know, Walgreens, store, or I don't think they sell them, but in any kind of a store where they would have sold them years ago, they probably don't now. You would have had to shown your age to buy that magazine. Um, and now this type of content, especially you mentioned porn, is so prevalent on the internet, and it's such a big thing, and you don't want children to have free access to that kind of thing. So how do you balance the protection of children and that kind of thing with the rights of free speech for the people that want to not only put out things that, and like you said, it's not, we can focus on the porn issue, but how long is it before someone needs a verification if they want to access political information or something else?
And I think that's the concern, and that actually goes to some of what we've seen on this Online Safety Act. There have been concerns about information on what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Ukraine being potentially taken down or age gated out of concerns of how the definitions under the Online Safety Act are, because it is much broader than what we saw even at hand in the recent case involving a Texas law that was age verification for adult online content that was more closely aligned, as the Supreme Court said, with that kind of traditional understanding of protecting young people from accessing that type of content in the offline world. And so the Supreme Court in that case decided to apply intermediate scrutiny to that law. But it did seem to, in my opinion, cabinet to that particular context. Now, there's a variety of other state laws similar to the UK law in question that are looking at much broader age verification, whether it be age verification for app store downloads or age verification for social media in general, or what are called age appropriate design codes, which basically say that until you know someone is an adult, that your product has to be designed in kind of a kid or teen safe way. So looking more at perhaps the algorithmic elements there. Those laws have been challenged in many cases, the broader laws that I just mentioned, by a group called Net Choice. One of them, notably, is currently pending potential emergency action at the Supreme Court involving a Mississippi law. So it remains to be seen. But what we have seen so far is that when it comes to the broader context of potential age verification or age verification for social media, most of the courts have enjoined those laws under the First Amendment rights of adults. The kind of more narrow laws that tend to focus only on this kind of adult sexual content, something that, to your point, would be more akin to kind of a bookstore that sold dirty magazines or something like that. Those are the ones that, in a much more narrow context, have tended to be upheld, as opposed to these broader ones, because they've been upheld on more traditional definitions of harm.
So Jennifer, I mentioned the article that I wanted to talk to you about, and it's the one again that you wrote. It's called "Is AI a horse or a zebra when it comes to the First Amendment?" And I think my first question when it comes to that is, what did you mean by that, a horse or a zebra?
So the title of this article comes from two references that I kind of smushed together that to me provide a good framework for thinking about this question. The first of which is the often heard saying of, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. So in many cases, AI is just an ongoing part of the conversation, of existing conversations we've had around the First Amendment, around speech in the online era, and even predating that, with kind of many forms of mass media or conversations we've had around how do we understand the ideas of free expression. Now, there may be times where it is a zebra, and that's what we need to be paying attention for. What are those cases where we are going to need greater clarity, or where actually kind of outdated ideas of what things mean might be preventing this from being a pro-expressive tool? In that regard, the other reason I chose that title is a reference to kind of a classic early internet law review and lecture by Judge Frank Easterbrook called "The Law of the Horse in Cyberspace," in which he kind of discusses why we should avoid over specialized law just to deal with new technologies. That typically our common law principles, when they are particularly ideal common law principles, are able to adapt to new technologies, and that we want to be cautious for a general purpose technology from developing a law of the horse and then having the question of, well, what do we do now that there are cars? If we have those kind of strong principles, they'll be able to adapt in many ways. And that what we should really be on our lookout for is, when are our existing common law principles not ideal? And when does technology potentially reveal that or challenge that? And so again, that's kind of the idea in this article is, we had these conversations about 30 years ago in the internet era around elements related to some of the questions of speech, and we largely got that right. We did not lose our principles. We stuck to them when it came to having this be a tool that could expand free expression. How do we ensure that we're getting those principles right in the AI era? And also, for some of those fears, do we have things at hand that already address some of the concerns?
One of the things I've always felt is the Supreme Court of the United States. We don't always agree with the rulings that it makes, but I can say, and I say this in, I guess, good faith, because some of the rulings that they came down with on the First Amendment, personally, maybe emotionally, I felt, I can't believe they did that. I can't believe they decided that they are consistent, and it comes down to, they will protect your right for free expression, even if it's offensive, even if it's hateful. In other words, they've decided that certain hate speech is not against the Constitution. So you have the right to say it, even though it may not be, pretty speech. And I think because of that consistency, I can sort of respect that, in looking at what they do. Going forward, when I look at AI, I feel the same way. It's kind of like, well, if the Supreme Court is consistent going forward, they will look at cases and they'll look at the timeless issues involved, and they'll look past the technology. An example of the technology that I see very immediately, and it's already been sort of disputed, is this issue of copyrights and trademarks and ownership of intellectual property on the internet, because AI has to train itself on existing content. Most of that content is copyright protected or owned by somebody. And it's like when people do a mixtape or something, or a DJ takes samples of different songs and comes up with an entirely new piece of work. But you have all these artists that are saying, yeah, but he used my guitar there, or somebody else is saying he used my voice, and why don't I get compensation for that? They're infringing on my rights. So there are all these sticky issues when it comes to AI, because in a sense it can sample anything out there on the internet and beyond, and come up with something entirely new, and not necessarily attribute or cite the source, not credit the source, and not compensate the source. So you've had major media organizations take issue with that, because they're feeling like they're the ones training somebody's AI free of charge, and the AI companies are going to make money from it, and that's just the business side of it, let alone the ownership issues. How have you looked at that, the whole intellectual property issue?
So I'm very cautious, and I very limit myself in terms of wading into intellectual property, in part because, as someone who looks at these issues from a libertarian principle point of view, I think there are strong libertarian or classical liberal arguments on both sides of the IP issue, whether it's for a strong protection of intellectual property as a property right, or for a strong view of fair use in the free market. Once you set something out there, you can't fully control what it's used for. But I do identify in the article, and I have said in my work before, that I do think if we consider how we've seen this in various other similar technologies in the past, whether it was VCRs or whether it was the internet, that copyright and intellectual property has tended to be one of those areas where we do need clearer guidance, both for innovators and for right holders. And that the reality is the answer is probably not going to be on either extreme. We can certainly imagine the negative impact on information and knowledge that having to license every single piece of information you train an AI program could have, particularly on small players. On the other hand, I certainly understand, artists who are concerned about the potential use of their works without their consent. We have seen ongoing conversations in the Copyright Office around AI and copyright. There are several key cases working their way through the courts. And I think this is certainly an area to continue to watch closely and to recognize, it's going to be a question of finding that right balance. And we might not find it right away. Again, if we look at things like the internet or like the VCR, there were similar concerns from the artistic community when those products initially arose. And we've now seen that they have been greatly beneficial to artists and being able to spread their work as well. So it's not always an either or, and some of it is also the evolution of an art form. And I know there are serious conversations going on around the use of AI in various arts. And again, that's one of those things I think we can't neglect the role of societal norms as well as any kind of policy framework in this conversation. And that's something that we're also witnessing evolve for, in many cases, in real time. And for those of us that are millennials, in some cases for the first time, because we were very young when the internet came about. And so this is kind of our first experience with seeing a new technology and the societal norms evolve around it.
Well, that's true. It's what's not is not necessarily that it's new, but I think too that how it's evolved even over the course of the years since the internet came. It wasn't like they had all the answers in the beginning there either. And when I look at it, and I think this is the pivot point that we're talking about here, is up until now you've had if you had a device, a tape recorder, that's a dumb machine. You press a button, it only works when you press the button. And when you evolve, then you move up to CD players. Same thing. They only play the music that's on them or whatever the recording is that's on them. And when you hit the play button, it works. It obeys you 100% if it works. And then you go on to the internet, and it's the same thing. You search, and it looks for the things that you want it to. Now things start to change because algorithms are built into the internet, so you don't necessarily get exactly what you're looking for. It doesn't give you exactly what you want it to give you. It's not as obedient as that tape recorder. So you evolve when you learn to deal with that technology. Then we move on, and things get more sophisticated. And as you said earlier, you talked about GPS systems and all those types of things that come in, medical equipment. I've had clients in the life sciences industry that are using technology, probably a lot of AI, to accelerate research, medical research, to try out different hypotheses virtually. So you have that, but you start to get to this point though with AI where it starts to think, it starts to problem solve, it starts to create on its own. And sure, it's trained to do that, and it is given parameters by human beings, but they're broad parameters because you want it to sort of develop and learn. So have you identified the word I might use is the high watermark, the high watermark for technology, where it gets to the point where we do need regulation because the technology has surpassed just being a tool?
So I think right now, when we're talking about technologies, we should focus on the applications of the technology, not the technology itself, because it's so hard to predict, if there is any point like that or when a point like that could occur. And many of the attempts we've seen are very crude in how they try and do that, in the sense of it'll be a certain amount of compute power or an ability to run, so many functions or something like that. And we can certainly imagine if we were trying to regulate personal computers in 1970, what we might have said is the maximum GPU that you would ever need. Anything bigger than this would, is now, and yet now, we carry things around in our pockets that have more computing power than what initially sent man to the moon, type of situation.
I love that example.
So that's why I'm always very cautious around the idea of regulating the technology in general. I think a better approach is if there are particular highly probable or highly concerning applications that we want to focus as narrowly as possible on that particular application, and try and resolve that particular issue. So there may be cases where we want to ensure that a human's in the loop, so to speak. And many of the cases that, in my opinion, come to mind are cases that involve the government's potential use of this technology. So, for example, things that may involve the criminal justice system, sentencing algorithms, or the use of AI in kind of facial recognition in terms of identifying people who may be suspected of a crime or something. We want to make sure that there is strong guidance to ensure that civil liberties aren't violated in that process. I think the other one that often comes out about are thoughts about the use of AI in the defense context. For example, the question of AI's use in nuclear weapons, or kind of the idea of killer robots or drones or things like that. And I think we have to be very cautious in both those contexts, because we want to be careful not to go as broad as to say, well, there can be no use of AI in the legal system or no use of AI in the Defense Department, because then you may accidentally ban, having an AI note taker that would actually create a less secure environment, because you have to have another person in that meeting, which raises greater risk of information potentially getting out there. Or with AI's use in the criminal justice system, the potential of an individual, interacting with the system to understand what's going on, the use of things like real-time translation or things like that can be incredibly beneficial. So we want to be cautious not to go as far as to say we need to regulate the entire technology, but to instead focus on what is that particular application that we have a concern about, and how can we try to narrowly tailor the policy to resolve the potential harm or catastrophic risk there.
I think an absolutist approach is the risk. People, like you said, all or nothing. They don't want any AI, and it's the same thing on the issues of the First Amendment. It has to be all free speech. There can be no. And when you start taking that absolutist approach and not a nuanced approach, as much as I always will favor the First Amendment, it's like, yeah, but you have to look what's the harm here? Where are the two entities and their rights crossing, and who's being harmed more than the other? What I mean by, and what I'll lead to with that is the when you talk about AI, and this is something that I do crisis communications, and some of the things that I've done with clients and in talking to some classes, I talk about transparency and accountability. And I think that's one of the key things with AI, because we already have technologies that do things. You have planes that fly on autopilot. So it's not like the pilot is always flying that plane, but there is a pilot behind the wheel of that plane in case something goes wrong. And then after something does go wrong, you might hear the investigators say, well, that was pilot error, but at the end of the day, there's a human being that has to be held accountable for whatever the machine does. And I think that's where we are headed with AI, and it's by design, because AI is supposed to do a lot more of the thinking that we have done up until this point. But there always has to be a human being that's held accountable, because otherwise, when you get to things like policy and other issues, if you can't, and this sounds simplistic, but if you can't blame somebody, then who will make sure the technologies are doing what they're supposed to be doing? Who will be the people that are taking responsibility for the technology? Because if technology itself is the thing that you have to hold accountable, well, technology has no feeling of fear, remorse, or those types of things.
Yeah, I think this is a point I try and discuss in the article a bit too, is that it's important though that we make sure that we're holding the right people accountable when it comes to that, that we're not just blaming the technology or the creators of a technology for the things that bad actors will inevitably do with the technology. In most cases, the technology itself is going to be a neutral actor. And unfortunately, what we know is that bad people will use otherwise good tools sometimes to do bad things. So when it comes to some of the concerns that we've seen around AI that end up actually being speech related, even though they might not always be thought of that at first, things like the use of AI to create non-consensual intimate imagery, or the use of AI to engage in defamation, or the use of AI to engage in fraud or in discrimination, or any other number of things like that. In many cases, we have existing laws in the books that if a bad actor does that in a typical situation, we know that they're accountable. And so if any kind of clarity is needed, it should be kind of the idea of, if you use an AI to do the bad thing, you still did the bad thing.
What's your worst fear when you think about AI? And I'd say that's a two-part question, because the first part of it is, what's your worst fear on people overregulating it, and what's your worst fear on what an unregulated AI could be?
I think my worst fear about kind of people over-regulating it, I'm gonna go with twofold. One is a concern that our fears drive the conversation, that we're so focused on what the worst thing that could happen is, that we see attempts to kind of close down, clamp down on the technology before we ever get an idea of what the potential benefits could be, because it's a very fear-driven conversation. The other fear I have around this technology here in the US when it comes to regulation is that we see the emergence of some sort of state patchwork of AI laws. In the last term, we saw over 1,000 bills related to AI introduced in state legislatures. Take a second to think about that. When was the last time you heard about over 1,000 bills on any particular kind of policy
Right.
area in the same year? If we start to see particularly large states, or we start to see particularly stringent regulatory regimes out of states, that could mean that a single state ends up derailing the potential for this technology across the country, and that potentially also lessens our global competitiveness when it comes to this new technology. Um, I think in terms of the unregulated element, I think that my to me, the most important thing is that we have to have conversations as a society as separate from policy conversations, and that there are certain things that are going to have to be set as societal norms, and that we're also going to have conversations around the critical thinking skills. How are we engaging with each other? How are we engaging with individuals, not just only in K-12 education, but at all stages of their lives, to understand what AI is, how they should use it, how they should take the information that they get from it, and what that actually means. That this is still a human task. You can't just say, well, ChatGPT told me so, the way that, at least I was taught as a child. You can't just say, well, I saw it on the internet, and assume that that's immediately the answer. That we've got to still make sure, and perhaps even more so now, that we're valuing critical thinking skills, and that we're valuing the kind of discourse and conversation that we have with each other.
Question for you on that. If someone, I saw a video right after college graduation season, and I forget what school it was, but there was a student in his cap and gown at the graduation ceremony holding a laptop. And he was, you couldn't quite hear what he was saying, but the story about it was he was thanking AI, ChatGPT, for his final paper. He basically was saying, as he was getting his diploma that day, that he was thanking it. And there are different schools of thought on that. I know some people, a professor actually at a very good school, who says AI is just a tool, like in a sense, like a calculator. We now let students who are engineering students and math students use calculators when they do certain things that we wouldn't have done when the calculator first came out. He said we have to learn, or she, we have to learn now to find a way to let students use this technology, but we also have to learn to how to make this technology help them become better problem solvers and better thinkers. That was her take on the whole thing. She wasn't sure exactly how that's going to happen because we are in an early stage here. Do you have any theories on that?
So as I mentioned, I'm a former K-12 teacher, and I also teach a law school class. So some of this is based on my own experience, and I'm certainly not going to try and tell any other professor or teacher what they have to do in their classroom, because this is not a one-size-fits-all question or answer. How using AI in a kindergarten phonics class and how using AI in a high school computer science class are going to look very different. How using AI in, freshman comp in college and how using AI in my law school elective class, they're going to look very different in terms of what the norms are and things there. And in all those cases, I don't think we should go so far as to say, well, ban AI from the classroom, but there are ways that teachers or professors may be able to use it to improve the way that they're interacting with students, and the way that students are able to learn, but it's going to look very different. So just like with a calculator, there are times where we say you can't use a calculator because you need to know how to use this skill. There may be times where a teacher says you can't use AI on this assignment because you need to show me that you understand this particular rule or that you know how to translate this particular passage or things like that. On the other hand, I think we also want to make sure that we're preparing young people for the realities of the workplace that they're going to encounter and the realities of these products likely being integrated into their lives and work. And so we don't want to go so far as to ban the use of them altogether. And so for many educators, it may also be a matter of thinking, how do you ensure that students are learning? How do you ensure what, performance on an exam looks like in a world where AI exists? So that may mean changing the way that we test in some cases, or that may mean, having a conversation around what those norms about when it is or isn't okay to use. Because, for example, if you just say no AI in the classroom, are you also saying no spell check, or something like that? Many things that have long been kind of accepted along the way.
I have two more questions, and this one here is a little bit tough because it's a question of sentience. And I read something years ago from the World Economic Forum about AI, and the last point that it made, I didn't think would come to fruition in our lifetime, and we're starting to look at having to deal with it. And that is, and it comes down to this question really with the First Amendment. Does AI, does a robot, does a machine have a First Amendment right to speak?
I think at this phase, there's always going to be a human involved to some degree. And this actually comes to some of the more difficult questions we've seen brought up around AI and Section 230, for example, which is a law that involves mostly online content moderation for user generated content and questions related to the First Amendment and algorithms more generally. When it comes to this kind of question of interacting, I think in almost every case where this issue actually arises, there's going to be a human involved at some step along the way. So where we're seeing, questions of, either a human prompting an AI and that therefore involving the human speech rights, or the way that prompt or output gets communicated involving a repost from a user or something like that, again, where there's going to be a user or a human in the loop. So I'm probably less interested in that question than I am in kind of looking at how will we see these interpretations work out of lines between perhaps what is considered the AI company's speech or the AI's speech, versus the kind of user generated element that seems to me to be involved in most of the scenarios that one can think of.
Well, that leads me to my final question, and that is democratization, coming back to that concept and the First Amendment. And that is for you, how do you see AI, if you, in your best case scenario, I guess, aiding in the democratization of technology and society?
I think there are so many ways, including our access to information, and I think one of the most exciting things is the ability to engage with people in different languages. The way we see AI being used in translation, and also the way we see AI potentially being used um, in helping us expand our own ideas and helping us understand a variety of points of view and things like that. I think that it's only going to further our ability to connect with one another if we use it correctly.
Jennifer Huddleston, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
The Shaping Opinion podcast is a production of O'Brien Communications. Copyright O'Brien Communications 2025. Find us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like to watch, go to YouTube, Rumble, or our Substack page, shapingopinion.com.